Well, hello again, or hello. Perhaps for some of you it's hello again. I'm Derek Bermel, and I'm the artist in residence here at the Institute for Advanced Study. So people are going to be kind of drifting in throughout the talk. Perhaps throughout the evening, different spirits will drift in and out. The end of time. We're gonna talk to you a little bit about the works tonight. I have these wonderful artists here. Actually, Elijah is Steve Gosling, who is at dinner right now, but he's not going to be joining us. He's officially the hardest working musician on this concert. He's playing in every piece, and that's why he's just taking a little break now from it all. Doesn't want to have to think about all these notes for a few minutes. So I have with me these very distinguished musicians, musicians. Steven Copes, all the way from St. Paul, Minnesota, to join us. He's the concertmaster with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, an excellent, excellent group, which you may hear on St. Paul Sunday sometimes. NPR, different, they also play live too, if you ever get to St. Paul. And other places, they tour. Ed Arron, wonderful cellist here in New York. Tara Helen O'Connor, who has a beautiful book with her name on it that I just saw.
My recital book.
Her recital book. It's really gorgeous. That was made for her by one of her students. It says Tara O'Connor in very flowery letters. One of the greats here. Plays a lot with Chamber Music Society, etc. in New York. And so I'm very privileged that these folks are performing here tonight, and it's a pleasure to play with them and to feature them on our series, which is the Edward T. Cone series. And tonight, we're actually going to hear music by Edward T. Cone, which you don't often get to do on the Edward T. Cone series. But in fact, tonight you're going to hear a work of his. And I'm just going to start by mentioning that work, which is called Aphorisms, or Aphorisms, depending on how you pronounce it, or if you're Steve, you may say, what does he say? Aphorisms. Yeah, because he's British. My dad would say aphorisms. My dad and mom are over there trying to be incognito, but he would probably say aphorisms, and she would say aphorisms. So there you go. It's like the same as apiary or apiary, right? Or something like that. So moving on, the cone piece is actually quite interesting because there are 25 or 26 different movements, and you can play them in any order. So Steve is choosing, one of the things that he has to do during his moments of respite right now, or respite, depending on how you pronounce it, is that he's going to be he's choosing, he's rolling the die or dice and figuring out. Sorry, maybe I should start again. Edward T. Cone. Anyway, you'll enjoy this piece. It's actually a lot of his work. It's quite different than a lot of his work. It's quite whimsical in nature because of this. And one of the interesting things about this piece is that it is possible to choose any number of the pieces. You can play them all. You can play some of them. You could even choose to play none of them, which would actually technically be a performance of the piece. He even says this. But if you choose to play none of them, but the thing is, you have to choose to play none of them. You can't just be sitting there like you all are and play none of them. That would not constitute a performance. But if he chose, after having learned the piece, to play none of them, that would constitute a performance. So, moving on.
Does that work for the other pieces on the program?
Right. That does not work for the other pieces. Sorry, folks. You gotta earn your pay.
She wants what you're
having.
She said she'd like to have what you're having.
Wants to have what I'm having. Okay. Yeah. It's funny because today I tend not to drink coffee on days when I have to play because it dehydrates you, and I usually drink a couple of cups of coffee. But finally, after a slightly pounding headache, I decided I did have a shot. So I'm just coming down from that. So give me a break. All right.
Nice.
to the rest of the program, which is the major part of the program. I just want to say before we start that tonight's program, every piece has a certain aspect of it. That there's a certain kind of mathematical aspect, and I should add as a caveat, most mathematicians here would consider it arithmetic more than we would consider it mathematics. What musicians consider mathematics, mathematicians consider kind of third grade kind of mathematics. But all these pieces have an aspect to them that has a way. For example, Bartók was a composer very, very influenced and very obsessed with the concept of the golden mean as a way to construct the formal aspects of a work, and that not only in the larger sense of the work, but also smaller phrases and sections of the piece. So he felt that this golden mean, which goes back to the Greeks and the geometry of the Greeks, was a way to had ramifications for temporal. For pieces that were moving forward in time, and he felt that it was a way to get to have a well-proportioned piece of music on many levels. So this is something quite interesting, and actually the major biographer of Bartók, Lendvai, or actually the major kind of theorist who analyzed a lot of Bartók's work, writes a lot about this. And if you're interested, you can go read that book, which is hard reading for a musician, but maybe not for a mathematician. The Kohn pieces, as I already said, have this aspect. I mean, and Kohn himself was a music theorist and was quite interested in intervals and the intervallic and quite specific about creating pieces that had very specific intervallic content. And his work that you'll hear tonight, even though these are very, very small pieces, they're all kind of very self-contained. In the language, I would say, of the kind of dodecaphonic school, the Viennese school, which flourished in the 20s and 30s, even through the 40s, into the 40s, with composers like Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, the students of Schoenberg. And in America, many of them came over to America, like Krennic, and many of them settled actually on the West Coast. Was he in St. Paul? Oh, I didn't know Krennic was in St. Paul. Okay, yeah. So many of them came over here, and could be that the widow of Krennic lives in the West Coast. I don't know. But anyway, so Kohn, now we're going to, so then there's my piece, which is Twin Trio, which is kind of based on different intervals. For me, I mean, I don't know if you'll hear this, this is kind of shop talk, but they're based on, the first piece is based on the interval of a major second and its corresponding mirror, which is the minor seventh in music, which is just the way it kind of revolves around the octave. The major second is this, quite easy to see. But the minor seventh, if I take this is a C and a D, if I take that D and I move it down an octave, then I have, and that's a minor seventh. So they're kind of partners. Oops, that was a beat. But the next movement is based on fourths and fifths, which are kind of an open sound, also which are kind of mirror partners of the octave. And then there are the following movement is based on small intervals like minor seconds and major seconds. That's for only clarinet and flute. And then the fourth movement is based on major thirds and minor sixths. So these are all kind of partner intervals that we have on the piano. But of course the music is not supposed to sound like a bunch of interval studies. It's actually, they each have their own character and is based on the idea of twins. And because the clarinet and flute are kind of brother and sister creatures, but they're slightly different. I was thinking about my friend, Aaron Kernis and Evelyn Lust, who had twins, but they were fraternal twins. They had a boy and a girl. And then they started off looking almost exactly the same, but they grew apart, and they, of course, grew very different. Their personalities grew. One was a boy, one was a girl. So it was interesting to watch them grow and kind of separate. And so that was the kind of, inspiration for that piece. And then we have the Messiaen Quartet, which he wrote in 1940, and around the same time as the Bartók, which was written a year or two earlier. but of course, interestingly, Bartók was in New York, so this is kind of, I'm sorry, Bartók was not in New York when he wrote this, but very soon came to New York, and by the time the full piece was premiered at Carnegie Hall, he was living in New York, and he wrote for the American clarinetist Benny Goodman, quite interesting, a Hungarian composer interested in Hungarian folk music, writing for an American jazz musician who was playing classical music. So it's kind of interesting displacements there. And then you think about Messiaen, who was in a prisoner of war camp, also kind of displacement, who premiered this piece for 5,000 prisoners in 1941, January 15th, 1941, in fact. And we don't know whether that was inside or outside, but we were speculating it must have been outside.
I don't think it was well heated.
It was not well heated.
Circumstances surrounding, yeah.
So that's our program. That's our program for tonight. And of course, the Messiaen also being many movements, but these are long movements as opposed to the cone, which are very short movements. The Messiaen, I don't know how many of you have heard it live before. It's not a piece you get to hear live very often, but it's quite, I think, transcendent in nature, and it's transcendent to play too as well. So I don't know if any of you guys wanted to say something in particular about any of the works, but we can also open it up for questions.
I'm just thinking of a quote that, which is maybe not the best thing to say right now, but it's the Thelonious Monk is saying, talking about music or writing about music is like dancing about architecture. It's like,
so who said that?
What?
I've heard that.
I've heard that
to
it's
so many people.
Yeah, maybe it's I don't know.
It's one of those apocryphal quotes or apocalyptic quotes.
Yeah, I mean it's nice to talk. We talked last night about especially the Messiaen and what a incredible experience it is to play. But rather than talking about it too much now, maybe. Just to say that it's a very extraordinary piece for its length and for kind of its musical language and just to kind of enjoy the listening experience for that piece especially. It's kind of a have to be there kind of thing.
Well, one thing that you said last night in the talk afterwards, which was quite interesting, is that you become a kind of a listener when you're playing this piece because you have to sit.
Yeah, I mean there's several movements where, well, there's one movement where the pianist is not playing, and another movement just for cello and piano, and another just for violin and piano, and those two movements are 8 minutes long, so you have to sit there on stage and be engaged in the performance in some way, and then be ready to play the next movement, which is...
And you have to listen to a solo clarinet piece, too. Which
solo
is not
clarinet, I forgot about that, yeah.
Those are probably all the pieces that you always tried to avoid when you were at school, and they thought, oh, no, there's a solo clarinet piece. Let me duck out for...
Well, actually, the Messiaen was always a piece I had kind of heard about. I didn't know so well, and it was kind of intimidating. Something about it was intimidating. Actually, the violinist Pamela Frank used to... the way I first became acquainted with it was she would play the last movement, which you'll hear me play with Steve Gosling, as part of her recital, which some people do now, and I think cellists sometimes do in recitals. And it's just it's called Praise to the Immortality of Jesus. So it can work in a program. I don't know if she did it as an encore even sometimes, which is pretty brave.
Yeah, and Ed, you mentioned a time when you heard
yes,
great performance.
I was going to mention my first exposure to this piece also was the cello and piano movement excerpted, and I was 15 years old, and I was at camp at Tanglewood. It was an 8-week high school program, and I remember showing up there, and everybody was very hyper and, bouncing off the walls and hormones, all over the place. And
that's okay. Okay, stop.
Great story, huh? No, and we were all shipped into the concert hall, not the shed, but the concert hall off to the side, where they have chamber music programs, and there was no program, nothing listed, and out came Yo-Yo Ma and Peter Serkin, and they just sat down and they played this piece. This, I realized, was in 1992, the year that Messiaen died, so they were obviously feeling the gravity of that, but it was just amazing how that changed me. It changed my day for sure, from showing up and being a kid to this jaw-dropping experience. I'd never heard it. I didn't know what the piece was while it was being played. And it's this sustained thing where time stands still in this piece. And it was just extraordinary, and everybody around me was feeling that too. And I will say, it's one of the live concert experiences that stayed with me more than just about any. So now that experience in the context of this larger work also makes it a unique performing experience. The piece is 8 movements long. Yes, we have to sit there and be an audience member to the other solo movements, which is a little bit different when you're on stage than when you're sitting in a chair. When eyes are on you and you're sitting there being an audience member, there's an intensity to that. And then, as Steve said, picking up and all of a sudden having to play and perform, and also just the juxtaposition. You have these very active movements, going the strenuous activity of bowing and all of this, and then all of a sudden coming to your movement where your bow has to be completely still and sustained. It's a real test physically and mentally to play this piece.
And those kinds of contrasts, I mean, not contrasts, but they make the experience of the piece, the slow movements even slower, and the fast movements feel even faster. I mean, it's I think this is something that good composers know, is how to play with time in the way that Messiaen does, to make one movement feel endless and ecstatic, and another movement feel so charged because it comes after something. And that kind of pacing is true in theater and dance, any of the performing arts that are temporal arts that take place in time. And so really the piece is kind of a lesson in time, in composition as well. I mean, in how to move through time and how to make, and the way that you can make people experience time in different ways. I was going to say, it's funny because Messiaen as a composer, I think many people don't think of him this way because he was very, very spiritual, very religious, Catholic, observant, and also was interested in birdsong and all kinds of very unusual things, Hindu rhythms and Japanese gagaku music and all kinds of, and theater, and it just had these very, very disparate interests from all over the place. But he's seen as a very serious composer somehow, and his music, he was part of a group called La Jeune France, I think it was, which operated in resistance to what they felt was this very light music of Les Six and these other composers like Milhaud and Poulenc and Auric, who were writing music that they felt was trivial, kind of, and serious about this. And he was apparently a very serious person. Many people say without a sense of humor. My teacher Dutilleux knew him quite well and felt that he was, just in a way kind of naive kind of person. And so what's interesting about it all is that I find that his music has a lot of humor despite that, and sometimes perhaps not even that he didn't even mean it to have a sense of humor. You get that sense, but that it still does have the sense of humor. Perhaps because of this naive quality, and it has very direct appeal, often to young people. When I was very young, and I heard the Messiaen 20 Regards, which is a piano piece, which is a 20-movement piano piece, but I heard just a couple of movements of it, as you heard that one movement, and you heard it. It had this incredible effect on me, and I remember when I finished hearing that, I was about 12 or something, 13 years old. I decided I want to be whatever that guy does, I want to do that. I want to be a composer. I remember seeing his name. It said Messiaen, and I knew what a composer was because I was playing Mozart and Brahms and these things and a lot of contemporary stuff too, Copland and other things. But at that time, when I heard that piece, I thought, I want to do that. And it had that effect on me as a young person, which I don't think many composers, Stravinsky does, The Rite of Spring, Ravel sometimes, but it just had that direct effect.
It's amazing that we have that in common, actually, through Messiaen, and ahead of this performance. It's
if you're a
thing.
YouTube junkie, you can go on, and there's a couple. I'd never seen heard him speak or anything, but there's something with him and his wife, who was a piano teacher and also she played the Ons Martineau.
And she played the premiere of the Vanguard and a lot of she was a great pianist.
There's a video of them explaining to a group of students or something, I can't remember, but bird song and bird calls, and him making the sound with just making the sound that he remembers, because he was a serious cataloger of birds, and then having her do it on the piano and her just laughing at him kind of at the same time, him, like you said, a little naive, just kind of in wonder about all this stuff, and her just kind of chuckling at him and how excited he was getting about bird calls.
Yeah, he would get up at about 4 every morning and go out and listen to the birds. He had a house in the south of France, and he would get up and he would see the colors. And Messiaen was what you would call synesthetic. He actually associated certain colors with very specific pitches and sounds, and he would notate. He notates in the score exactly what color you're playing at any given point, and what bird is singing, and maybe what Hindu rhythm is playing, and what where he got this idea from in the scripture. I mean, so you've got all this stuff in the music as well as the crazy rhythms and notes, and it's and tempos which he gives you a very slow tempo, but would notate it in a way that's very different than the way you would normally see notated if you were playing in an orchestra. So you actually have to get yourself into something. He wants you to feel beats that are slow like this. 1, 2, 3. Now that's very hard because as musicians we tend to subdivide a lot, and to hear beats like that's very difficult. So what was the piece that made you want to be a flute player? I'm curious.
Well, I know who inspired me to become a flute player, but the first piece, probably, you're not going to believe this, but probably a Chopin nocturne that I had been learning on the piano, and then I heard my neighbor play, and I thought that would be kind of cool on the flute, No, seriously, I was a really serious pianist before I played the flute, so.
Oh, so you came to the, right, okay, so it was not your first instrument.
No.
And who's the flutist that you? My
neighbor, actually. I had a neighbor who played the flute really well, who turned out to be
Jean-Pierre Rampal?
No, but actually Jean-Pierre Rampal, my cousin gave me a record of his when I was maybe 10, and I thought, that's incredible. I have to do that. That's what I knew as soon as I heard the instrument, it had to be that.
And did you ever look back and say, boy, I could have played more notes on the piano at one given time?
Well, I look at, like, on my piano I have the Goldberg variations, and I'm trying to learn that, and I have such bad left-hand technique, actually. On the flute it's fine, but on the piano it's like, this doesn't work the same way. And so that's frustrating for me. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do,
Yeah,
because I'm also a frustrated pianist, but
I love the piano repertoire, piano or cello. I mean, the flute, we don't have Brahms. We have the great symphonies. No, sorry, no offense. But
we don't have
we don't have that kind of repertoire.
Sad twins.
Sad. Yeah, it's very sad.
You've got some good repertoire.
But there's a big hole in it.
The thing is,
you have some of the best pieces ever written. Anyone.
No, you know why this is true?
Yeah.
Because we have the pieces, the composers, where they would write for clarinet and then they would die. It's true. Mozart, Schubert, Shepherd on the Rock, Brahms died.
Right
he
away.
wrote 3 great pieces and then
boom, that was it.
Boom, he died. There's a lot of them. I mean, it's almost like the 9 symphonies thing. It's really it's a deterrent. Yeah.
What is it about the clarinet that makes people just want to
sick? Makes them sick.
Kick it. Yeah, they just want to kick it. And there are many clarinet composers. Actually, today there are quite a number of clarinetist composers kind of out there. You don't always know, but there are, like John Adams is one
That's true.
John was a clarinetist. And I don't know. I'm kind of blanking. I mean, Jörg Widmann and people like that. But I'm trying to think of there are some quite well-known composers who are clarinetists, but. John did play clarinet, and he was quite a good clarinet player. Yep. And so it is an instrument that somehow a lot of composers come out of that instrument, as opposed to flute. There aren't as many,
A couple of conductors,
Kulau
but
and,
Kulau, yeah. Brahms was a big fan of Kulau.
Brahms was a fan of
Yeah,
Kulau.
I thought Kulau was just great.
Kulau.
Yeah.
Well, are there violin? A lot of composer violinists back there in that rep.
Yes.
I mean, these guys have great rep. They have great rep. We have rep.
We have
envy.
almost too much.
Rep envy, definitely.
And still we steal
But-
repertoire from clarinetists and flutists.
I'm just going to say the flute has great repertoire. Also, the flute has repertoire from Baroque music.
Yeah, we have.
That we
That's
don't.
incredible.
Back then, there was only G clarinet in G, things like that. So we had composers like Molter. Who's heard of him? I don't know.
I have actually.
Well,
I sit on juries,
You
and
did a
you
doctorate,
hear.
right?
Yeah, I did a doctorate. Okay, it's all right.
can I ask if there are any questions out there? And we'll repeat the question. So if you don't hear it, don't panic. Yeah.
I guess I have two questions that I've wondered about, and I can't quite decide whether to get to the general question or make it kind of specific. What I'm interested in is,
You make it general, we'll make it specific.
all right, well, in terms of tonight's pieces, when you discuss them or practice them, are there things that you have to work out as to how you're going to play the piece, and if you have disagreements about it, or in preparing the performance, what is that like for a given piece? There are some pieces where it's more of an issue than others. And then kind of an opposite question, which is, during the performance, thinking of chamber pieces, I've often wondered the extent to which you influence each other just in the moment by how you're playing, or is classic
That's a
music
good
so
question. Yeah.
sort of rigid that you kind of just do it?
I want Tara to answer the first question because she has to play with the composer, which is very unnerving in some ways, probably.
But it's really fun because if I have a question, I can get it answered immediately, and I like that direct kind of interaction. But when we're putting together a new piece by the composer who's standing in front of you, the first thing that I do, the first thing I did, I think, was I emailed you and I said I need a score. So I wanted to see what everybody else was doing. Like, I had my stuff, but I wanted to make sure that when I walked into the room, that all my notes and all the rhythms and everything was in the right place. And then I had a sense of what everybody else was doing. So that, and also visually, I take a lot of notes in my part. We're all very different with how we approach each piece, but we write things in that we need, other rhythmic cues, or somebody enters here, and they're very specific, actually, and that helps you orient yourself not only in the sense of the timing of it, but also visually, you get used to seeing that as the page changes with your markings and the original markings, that actually helps you with the process. Then you come in and we start rehearsing, and there's a lot of information already that we have. We know how fast it goes. We know there's probably a few descriptive words in there that tell you the style of the piece and that kind of thing, and how it might be played. But then you start listening and you start playing together, and then there are subtle changes in just as in like, I guess, accents and that kind of thing. There are subtle changes in articulation and sounds and color, and then rather than being an individual, you start becoming part of a collective, and that process is fascinating for me because as a flutist, I'm used to my sound from my practicing, but when I get together, I want to see how I can get into somebody else's sound and then make a new sound. So there's all these things going on all the time.
I just want to say one thing about like a composer like Messiaen, because many composers put all kinds of different things into, or they don't put into their work, and then as a performer, you have to parse this out. And if you're the composer and the performer, as I often am, it's quite a schizophrenic experience because I'm saying, damn, why did the composer put that stupid, oh, that was me, but if you're playing, say, Messiaen, you'll get information like, it'll say chartreuse with flecks of blue, green,
Amber.
or an aura, and you're like, what? I mean, it has nothing to do, there's no possible use for that information. I'm sorry. Because I know that you can find something out about him, but the thing is that's like Scriabin also had color influence. Many composers, Michael Torke had color influence, but the thing is that it doesn't mean anything to a different person. It's a completely personal thing, and that is information that actually, I mean, it's interesting from a kind of historico-theoretical perspective, but removed from performance. It has nothing to do with performance. It can't possibly help you to know that, except to know that it gives you some kind of vibe of where he's coming from. But but so composers put lots of unnecessary information and then miss all kinds of necessary information. For example, in Tara's beautiful notebook, flowery notebook, with all her incredible scores that she's so organized with, she has, for some pieces which have tons and tons of notes, information, technical information, but no information saying, delicately or play with feeling or something. There's nothing like that in the piece, and that's infuriating also as a performer when you've got lots and lots of information that's technical, but no way into the piece from an emotional or a human kind of standpoint. As a human being, when you're playing this music, how do I approach this? And that's also really tough, especially if you're premiering a new piece. So, anyway, to you guys.
Well, I just had, in speaking with that, for you, how does it feel? Playing a brand new piece, you're playing the new piece, you're in it, and you also have to observe the process. What does that do for you in a case like Twin Trio the first time? Because
the thing is that, first of all, Twin Trio was a commission from 20 flute and clarinet and piano ensembles, and it was a commission that it was called a consortium, when a whole bunch of people commissioned a piece, and then they play it, and I didn't play it until all those 20 people had already done their premiere performances of it. I think all of them did it. I didn't keep track, but a few of them did it anyway. It's a hard piece, but they did. But when I sat down to learn it, I probably go through this rehearsal process, and usually I'm hard on myself, so I'm sitting there saying, "Oh, why didn't I write that?" And the pianist is kind of saying, "Oh boy, this is tricky. I'm sorry, I'm messing this up," and I'm thinking, "Oh boy, I could have made that easier," or I'm saying, or the flute is having an issue with something, or something is not written in their part, and then I'm writing it into my part. Okay, make sure to put this in the next edition or something, because it was published very quickly, and there are errors in the score, which we found some errors, right. And I mark those down when I remember, and then I make sure that in the next version, that will be corrected. So I'm thinking in a lot of those ways. But one thing that really does get my goat, as you were saying, is when you walk into that rehearsal, and someone like Tara or these folks are super prepared. We expect when we go to a rehearsal, at this level of the highest level of playing chamber music with these folks, they walk in and they expect that where what they're doing and where the cues are, and if you walk in and you haven't prepared, people are gonna, because there's gonna be a bad feeling in that moment when they realize that you have not put their cues into your part.
Right, that's...
It's interesting. That's our lives, basically. Every week we have a different project where we have to show up with people we know to a certain extent, more or less, and somehow get off on the right foot, but also there's a lot of work to be done. And I feel like this Messiaen actually is a great example to the two questions that you asked, because it requires a lot of personal preparation, that piece. It's technically very difficult. The sheet is a labyrinth of information that you have to be able to decode on your own. And so, yes, you want to show up as prepared as possible to the rehearsal so you don't fall on your face. But at the same time, if you practice something too much and it's too rigid, you've gotten yourself into a certain place, and then all of a sudden you're playing in unison with other people and you have to make adjustments, it's very hard to undo a lot of that. So this Messiaen is, I think, the most challenging thing in the repertoire in that respect. Actually, you have to get it to a certain point, but you have to leave room. I mean, I practiced with a metronome. I got all my fingerings together. All of a sudden, I'm hearing people on both sides of me and having to react to all of that. And I realized, in a certain way that I was getting diminishing returns by having prepared too much. And the other thing I would just mention, I think that also applies to your questions, is in our dress rehearsal yesterday, we did the solo movements with the other guys sitting around so that the solo person had an opportunity to feel what it was like to play it on the stage with the other people sitting around them, which definitely changes the what's going on around you, and also for us to sit there and feel what it was like to listen to that and then pick up and switch your brain to play in another thing. So there is that also.
Also, part of your very great questions, or one of them was about how you something about communicating in the concert, and that's just that's something and in rehearsal, but it's something in a concert, which is really, you can only practice in a concert, and from doing lots of concerts and from working with people that are more experienced than you are, and maybe know the piece you're working on better than you do, and that's just that's something which some people have a natural gift for just being so open and vulnerable and able to not be so self-conscious about what their particular difficulties are with their instrument, and really initiate. I like the word initiating because there's a lot of great players. We know a lot of great players that maybe can play on their own really well, but are not the most, have prepared their part, like you said, but they don't. You can't get them to respond, and so
I think flexible chamber musicians are attracted to one another, actually, which is why this group, we are constantly,
but also like musical initiate, like someone that in a moment in a performance where you haven't talked about it, but someone wants to change something in some way, and it's like an ESP thing, and you can really do that. I mean, I think I'm not sure that these Messiaen and Bartók are the best examples of pieces where that has the most potential to happen. I'm not sure, but like a Brahms or Mozart, like things can happen in so many varieties of ways that and to have everybody cluing in. So
I think the Brahms and Mozart quintets that Steve and I played together. Was it 4 times in a few weeks ago? Yeah, and the things from one concert to the next that went on it was such fun, and there was such spontaneity, and if I think back about, I could almost attribute an adjective, to describe each concert. Oh, this concert was, we let it all hang out. Oh, this concert was really refined and kind of, a little more serious-minded, and each had such really fun qualities to them. Well, no, there's just something, electricity in the air, and also mutual trust and admiration and all of those things. Oh, he's doing something there. I'm going to support him.
Too,
yeah.
Well, but also it speaks to the rehearsal process. When you come in and you're that prepared, and you're basically feeling each other out and how it goes, and then you're not practicing to plan out exactly what you're doing. You're practicing and learning this together, so that in the moment, in the true moment of artistic expression, that you can be free to do what the music inspires you to do and the people around you to do, and then that takes you in another direction, which is an amazing process, which keeps us doing it all the time. It's amazing.
I was just going to say one thing. In the world that I live in, a lot of the time is the world of having someone waving their hands in front of me, and a lot of them are very, very intelligent people, but they don't. I'm not sure a lot of them play instruments regularly, or even play. They don't have to do a process like we do, like chamber music, and so that whole thing is gone. And this thing that Tara was talking about planning everything. You know, they're sitting in their hotel room with their score and planning, I'm going to get this crescendo if they don't do it. The best conductors are the ones that are there, they're prepared, they're brilliant and whatever, and but they also know how to, like in chamber music, trust the group that's in front of them and know what things to know, the important, how to use their time and what things to talk about, and you know what, and how they can really, I mean, it's so rare to have a conductor who I actually feel like I want and I need to look at them, because most of them I really don't need to. I can see them peripherally, but most of them I don't need to see their face because I know what they're, it's just not.
Yeah, there's that good viola joke about that Rite of Spring thing. Yes. Or, well, we won't tell that now.
Maybe later.
Well, anyway, it's nice when you work with someone like that who's a chamber musician, even being in that kind of position, and that you know you're making music in that way. And with these guys, it's like, you know, it's difficult to play concerts, and when you're different every night. Like right now, I feel very different than I did last night, and I don't. You have that expectation. You don't know what's going to happen, and so you need people you trust, and when you're out there, you mostly having fun and really, you know, cherishing the time on stage. So.
Yeah, and you know, I wanted to say also just that when I'm for my pieces, what's really fun about playing them with some like Tara and Steve is that other Steve is that he's not here right now, but Steve, yeah. Out there, but it's that they really. What's fun about that is that I feel like, you know, with chamber music, what happens is that as these guys are talking, you get to certain levels of working on a piece, and that first level is really just making sure everything is kind of in its proper place. And the second level is really kind of saying, okay, if this goes wrong, we kind of do this, and who's cueing and getting this. And then that third level is that level of trust where that stuff is kind of, you've established that stuff, so you kind of know, well, if there's a problem, then this will happen. But then that's letting the fun, that's the fun part, when you really start to allow new things to happen and people try things and then you go with what they're doing and you're curious about what they might do. And that's what's fun about working with you guys on this piece, because it's a piece of mine, but I feel like I'm kind of playing and having fun with it. And I'm not feeling like all I have to do is keep it together, which is often the case when I'm playing my own works and there are other people playing and I feel like I'm kind of, you know, everyone's looking to me to keep it together. But it's kind of fun when you can just relax a little bit and have fun with your own music too.
Yeah.
So
there's two questions.
Yeah. I guess that would have to be me. Well, maybe, I mean, I think what you were talking about in the Messiaen is relevant about the timelessness.
Yeah, the time stands still in this piece, and there is this sense that he's got a foot in the afterlife, in another world where, you know, the 24-hour clock does not necessarily apply. And I think this piece does transport you. Obviously, has a lot to do with eternity out of his devout religion and all of that. So I think that's the influence in the Messiaen. How you've, I don't know, put these pieces together to title the program. You might want to.
Do you have insight into the Bartok there?
Yeah, I don't know if there's. You know, I would not try to make a connection between the Bartok and the Messiaen so much in that respect about time. But I was just thinking how much. I mean, I think it's not, in a way, it's not that different from other. I have certain pieces that are like cropping up into my head that seem timeless. I mean, like Schubert B-flat piano sonata. I hear that first movement, and I just kind of. You know, I just don't even know where I am, and almost everything of Bach's for some reason. I don't know why that is, but Messiaen has that quality, which it's something about not enveloping one idea so strongly, like it seemed like Schumann, Brahms did, and don't know how articulate I'm being about but the music is so around one kind of aesthetic that it's very active and it's very I don't even know, maybe you can complete my
Well,
thoughts.
there's something about the Messiaen itself. I said something about the kind of mathematical aspects of these other works, but not about the Messiaen. And actually, he's a composer who articulated, who outlined his whole theory of what he was doing in a treatise called Technique de mon langage musical. And he actually wrote, this chord means this, and I use these particular intervals and these particular modes and scales. He used certain modes called modes of limited transposition, and which were basically, sometimes they were as simple as the octatonic scale, which is a certain kind of scale that Stravinsky used a lot, which is this. With even numbers of whole and half tones. But then sometimes they were his own modes that he uses that nobody... Mode is just like another word kind of for a scale. But then also he has things called non-retrogradable rhythms, which are to do with symmetry, symmetrical rhythms that open from the inside. It's too complicated.
If you look at the insert, maybe the front page, the inner page of the piano score of the Messiaen, there's a whole basically treatise on rhythm, and it's fun to look at. I can't read the French, but it's it's fun to look at, and he's obviously making these groupings of different rhythms and some theory.
It's a manipulation of time as we know it, and I think you'll sense that as you listen to the work.
That's a piece that also has this kind of mathematical. Mindset in writing. And what I thought was interesting was to kind of juxtapose, first of all, these three kinds of strains of music that were going on at the time around 1940, around during the time of the war. Messiaen, who had this way of writing that was very particular and very influenced also by Stravinsky, Debussy, Wagner, coming from that school, but then also the kind of Schoenberg school that came out of Mahler and Brahms and other folks, which is more exemplified in the Cone pieces, which are also about time, but they're very, very short. So very different than the Messiaen, which is quite, as you said, timeless. And so a very different way of thinking about time and these tiny little aphorisms or aphorisms. And then Bartók, who thought also in this mathematical way, but thought about relations and proportions using the golden mean, and of course was also very concerned with modes and used all kinds of different modes. But just his thinking about time and structure was very different than Messiaen, who had a kind of, in some ways, very programmatic concept of time as well. That in Messiaen, it's quite interesting because music, certain things that he writes, they are, the baby Jesus, or they are this color, or they are this concept, and so it's. I find that quite interesting for him. He's very concrete in that way. So to get back to what you asked, the end of time, I just thought it was interesting to kind of, the more I was working with these pieces, the more I saw that they were all coming from this very kind of, the composers had this kind of very mathematical construct in making the piece. And I thought that was more interesting. And I suppose we called it the end of time because it was Messiaen, the quartet for the end of time. But in a way, I thought in this way, that sometimes you program and you want to have two similar kinds of pieces or several similar pieces from a similar aesthetic or a similar period. And here what I was trying to do is actually take quite different aesthetics and put them together, but with the common theme of this construct. So who knows, in the end it's more for the audience what you perceive after the concert, whether the works moved you in whatever way they did. So I know you had a question, sir.
Yeah, this has to do with deciding that I'm going to be a soloist or a chamber musician. Because, because do you have a judgment about soloists? Because the collaborative listening, your definition of a chamber musician sounds like my definition of a musician. And so people who said, well, I'm not I can listen to other people, but I don't want to play with them, or I don't want to collaborate, or I want to be alone on the stage with maybe a pianist, but maybe not, or just the pianist, So, and you all had to make that decision, didn't you, at some point? Maybe I don't want to be alone on the stage ever. I always want to have buddies to share the fun with.
Yeah.
I think, well, I think present company definitely arrived at an understanding of how rich collaborative playing can be as an experience, and how rich and vast the repertoire is. And there are a lot of people who play solos out there who also play chamber music. I feel like we are soloists because we each have our own voice in an ensemble in a way, but that we are operating in dialogue with one another. And I personally find that more satisfying in many cases than to go out and just play a piece that I've learned by myself. I think there are a lot of people who have achieved careers, very lucrative careers, where they are the person in the spotlight, and that's sort of a branding thing, and there are certain musicians, I think, who have a mentality of being a soloist who don't collaborate as well as perhaps more humble individuals or something like that. But these days, I think a lot of those definitions, a lot of those lines are blurred. Mm-hmm. You have people who are out there. Each one of us plays concertos with orchestras. Each one of us plays unaccompanied recitals, accompanied recitals, and a bulk of what we each do, I think, is collaborative. There's, and we're all defined, I think, by something a few layers beneath those definitions.
Well, and it's
what we value in
you need to I mean, all these great, if you play the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto and you've never played any of the Mendelssohn string quintets or the octet, and you never played second violin in a Mendelssohn string quintet, then you're gonna play the concerto differently with a group of people. You're just gonna, similarly, if you've never played a Mozart violin concerto and then you have to play first violin and G minor string quintet, you're going to miss, a big part of Mozart's chamber music, at least with strings, is you have the first violin in a very prominent role and in some of the divertimenti, and you have to be, some of them are just as demanding as the concerto. So you have to have that mindset for certain parts of a piece. What you have to know when you come out and be the soloist and come back down, and it just goes the same for concertos.
The
there's
more
lots of parts in concertos
sensibilities you can incorporate, the better, I think. Yeah.
The assumption that concertos are harder because they're soloists, and that may not be true, but don't they assume that?
They get more money to play concertos.
Yeah, you do get a higher fee.
Which,
yeah.
There's something to that. Yeah, I think concerto soloists get, in a way, more superficial glory.
Collaboration may be, in fact, harder.
Yeah, I think so. And absolutely.
Well, the word concerto means concert, like where we are going to be tonight. It means together. So that's something to be thinking about. It's not just, it's about playing with other people. Even if you're playing concerto, if you're not tuned to what's going on behind you, there's going to be that disconnect between what comes out of the violin or whatever instrument it is and the orchestra behind it, because there's not the listening going on that there needs to be, and because it is the definition of a concerto is the kind of textbook definition is a piece which gives as much to the soloist as it gives to the orchestra, meaning not more to the soloist. It's not like the soloist is more important than the orchestra, but it's a collaboration. So in that same way, I think, and it's true, it's also a collaborative with the audience. Like, you all are going to be part of the performance tonight. How you are is maybe as important as how we are. So it's a kind of a circle.
It's a very different experience, though, playing concertos with conductors and playing concertos where you're leading the group, and I've done both, and they're very different experiences, because when you're playing with a conductor, you're going off cues, and you're going off what you hear behind you, but also who's at the helm, basically. Whereas if you're doing a concerto and you're leading, it's the playing that happens behind you is very different. Everybody has a little bit more at stake because nobody wants to be left behind or left in the dust, as it were. And it's a very exciting collaborative experience.
But it is a different mindset preparation-wise, and I think just mentally to go out and play a concerto often than it is to play. I mean, if I have to go out and play Kurt Weill Violin Concerto, I've never played it before, and it's not a well-known piece. I have to really. It's just a different way of working because you're the only person up there. In that piece, you're the only string player, aside from a couple bass players, and yeah, I mean, it's a different when you're doing some chamber music. You can't go out with that mindset, otherwise it's not going to be successful. If you're doing a recital, you have a collaborator. So, and if you're doing a solo recital with no, it's a different.
Are all professional chamber musicians soloists? I mean, do all of them do solo concerts, or some of them, or what's?
Well, I would say all these folks, we all work in many, many different contexts. Some as chamber musicians, some as soloists, and it just, you wear many hats. I mean, I think a lot of good musicians do that.
More so these days than ever before. I think that those lines were just more clearly delineated in generations past.
Yeah, and I think now it's less. But I'm going to give them a chance to kind of get their groove in the next half hour before we start the concert. And I want to thank these terrific musicians for joining me on stage, and thank all of you. Thanks.
Thank you.